So, you made it through the first week of the mid-season buy block. Was it kind to you? Was it painful for you? Regardless, we've got another month for AFL Fantasy. Maximum 3 trades a week available to you. SuperCoach and Dream Teamers. Whew, you could go real crazy if you got a boost. Regardless, some big decisions to make. 4 teams have come off the bye that are players we need to unpack. 2 away, but some very relevant names are missing. And boy, oh boy, did we remind ourselves last week that if you don't have premiums on field and you're just counting 18 green dots, you could be getting some rubbish scores. Hello, Filippo. Hello, Cleary. And hello, Bice in AFL Fantasy and Dream Team. Joining me on this week's strategy session to talk through all the big issues is fellow coaches, panelist, MiniMonk. Hello, mate. Nice to be chatting with you. And what a week with observations, reflections, learnings, but also a little bit misleading if we're not too careful.
Absolutely so. I think you summed up a lot of the sentiment of coaches very early on with that trifecta of pain with Cleary, Bice, and Filippo all getting subbed in/out in AFL Fantasy, all on single-digit scores. Marek subbed out as well. My word, what an absolute disaster class of a week. But the good thing is, it can hopefully only get better. We've only got the 2 teams on the bye this round, which is Freo and St Kilda. Does make it a bit easier. Does make stomaching the Filippo sub out a little bit easier because you were saying, I would have benched him this week anyways. It doesn't matter. But realistically, we should be in a position where those single-digit scores, unless you have another baker's dozen worth of them, or however many, even a half dozen worth, we shouldn't have to be carrying single-digit scores. So let's have a chat about how best to navigate these next 4 weeks of buys, in particular this particular buy.
At least by teams available this week, it should be one of the easier to navigate. But let's not discount the amount of relevant premium players, and that's who we should be really counting. If you were just counting green dots last week, you had 18 on field and you were running the Cleary, the Poe, the Bice, the Marich. Ouch. A bit of bad luck in all, absolutely, but ouch. This is why we talked last week about counting your premium performance, not just counting green dots. But let's not discount how potentially pain-filled this week could be for us, Minnie. No Clark in the backline, no Sinclair in the backline, no Wanganeen Miller in the backline. And to a lesser extent, you could throw a Luke Ryan, but certainly those 3 have been really, really critical for us. In the midfield, Andy Brayshaw has been one of the best performing premium mids for the year. Jack Steele's returning to some form. Caleb Sarong, certainly in Supercoach, has been solid, not been spectacular, but been solid. Luke Jackson's been outstanding this year. He's not getting the flowers that he deserves. And then from a forward line perspective, you do have Filippo, as you've mentioned too. You do have McRae still sitting in a bunch of teams, and a Shai Bolton is also sitting in there, let alone the red dead dots of Closey, Hall, Gross, Simpson, Hayes, Bustlinger. The names go on. How should we be approaching this week? Because again, first value look feels easier to get to a higher volume of premiums, but a bit of a misleading week. What's the mindset overarching we should be heading into this week? 4 teams in, off the bye, 2 off. Feels easier, but is it as easy as we think navigating this week?
It's easier in a way, but you still have to be very careful about decisions that you're making. And especially in your limited trade formats, as you're starting to get towards, if not into your single digit territory with the number of trades you have left available to you. The priority is, as always, when we come to the buys, is that you want to be targeting players that are coming off of the buys where possible. Now, that's not entirely possible across every line and across every price point because, frankly, there's not many good rookies that are coming off of any of the 4 teams that have just missed. I don't really see anyone from Carlton, North Melbourne, the Dogs, or Port Adelaide putting their hands up as a genuinely rookie-priced player. Granted, we do have a couple of other players that have put up their heads across the formats as potential options, which is good. But in terms of the premium targets for these ones, we've got a real mixed bag in terms of who's available to us. You know, we go to Carlton. You're probably maybe considering someone like a Sam Walsh. Maybe some people go for a Paddy Cripps. Tom De Koning could be a consideration for coaches to trade back into in the ruck line. North Melbourne, Tristan Cherry is obviously leading the charge as the highest averaging ruckman across the formats this year. And man, he's been phenomenal. But the price tag, it makes it just super hard to attain him when we're struggling to get to, 22 premiums in AFL Fantasy and potentially 22 or maybe even 23 in SuperCoach and Dream Team. Sheasel is still a consideration. LDU maybe. Dogs headlined by Bontempelli, who's just an absolute stud of a player. But again, still not cheap across the formats. And in Port Adelaide, if you want to have a go at someone like Zach Butters, it's probably not this week. It's got the Bedford tag pretty clearly lined up for him, and I don't think I'd be going there because of that. But say you don't have a Connor Rosie, he might be one that's worthwhile going to. Or even if you wanted to save value, you could even consider someone like a Bergman. He's genuinely still a reasonable option, especially with no JHF. But we've talked about the premium targets. What makes it really interesting is how you get that combination of both premiums and rookies in at the same time. And that's obviously the struggle. In SuperCoach and DT, it might be that you have to pull 3 trades and do 2 down, 1 up. In AFL Fantasy, you might end up getting a bit creative and look at some of these value options. We talked about him last week and he popped out a reasonable score, but Kai Lohman is still a fairly reasonable option for coaches this week in AFL Fantasy, just as a 400k forward who's still just going to be playing games every single week that he's fit. I mean, if he pops a 55, that might be the difference between one of those single-digit scores that you had on field last week. That's 45 points right there, which is really nothing to scoff at. Some people are even looking at players like a Hardiman. A Cooper Lord has come into the conversation for some people as a genuinely cheaper player that's from a team coming off the bye. I don't know how much I love it, but then there's also someone like an Ed Allen who coaches might be considering as a midfielder in AFL Fantasy at a fairly reasonable price point as well, with a buy coming up soon, of course. But these are the types of players that are starting to get thrown into the conversation now. And it makes it a lot more interesting because we have divergent pathways before we even start to talk about the other rookies that might be coming up. I want to get your thoughts on some of these, mid 400k players. This is probably more AFL Fantasy type play than it is a SuperCoach type. But what are your thoughts on the players like the likes of Lohman, like Hardiman, like Lord, like Ed Allen, and throw in any others that you think might be in that similar sort of category?
I actually think in AFL Fantasy, again, SuperCoach, different price points, different variables, all that stuff. And also, player like a Clark's on the bubble for you this week, a player like Pedlar's on the bubble for you this week. We'll get to them, I'm sure, in a moment.
Yes.
But I think you need to be looking at least one of those type of players this week, sort of the 400 to 500 club. You need to be looking at one of them this week in AFL Fantasy as a micro maneuver, regardless of if a McCarthy comes in and debuts from the West Coast Eagles. I think you need one, whether it's Hardiman to access some of that Riley Bice cash, whether it's a Lohman to access some of that limited Cleary cash or a Marich piece of cash. These sort of, I'm going to stretch into a guy that's either still far enough from the buy, already had it over a 4-week period. I can see about $80,000 to $100,000 of team value being increased on that player singular. And as a result, I feel confident I could probably jag 3, 4, 5 weeks of a 60 average as a roll-up. If you can identify at least one player that fits your structure like that, you might have to even go 2. If a player like a Tom McCarthy doesn't come in and play, I think that is the pathway you need. I like the mindset of an Ed Allen, but I don't like it for a number of different reasons this week. And I'll tell you why. One, it's a King's birthday Monday, so you're waiting all the way deep into the round, and politely, he should be named and should play, but you're going to get one price movement. You're not going to have him accessible to you next week. And after that, DeGoey's close, Mitchell's close. Is he really best 22? I feel like it's a 1-week hit, and I just don't want a piece of that. I'd rather get into a Hardiman or a Lohman. To me, that would be the role. So I'd be looking at one of those 2 would be my leading sort of 400k to 500k club. I know Sheldrick's around that spot, but similar in the range of Ed Allen, where he's literally walking into his bye straight off that, despite a great matchup. I also still think he's a bit vest concerny to me. That said, he's had a great fortnight. So I think you need one. I think we might need two, but definitely we need one. And depending on your team's structure, you should be going there. Hardiman's advantage is he's off the bye. Lohman's is you've got a month basically to roll him in. I think you need one. And if you don't have one, you're running into the risk of high red dots. Because again, we talked about it. We've got El Hawley, Buslinger, Gross, Hayes, Closey is still in some teams. Moraes, more in Supercoach and Dream Team than AFL Fantasy. They've got nothing more than $50,000 on top of them that you're going to make. A 50k sideways trade like that, even in a unlimited trade style of AFL Fantasy, is that really going to do anything for you? I just don't think that's going to get you to where you want to get to, these $50, $60, $70,000 moves. I'm just not a fan of that. I want to ask you off the back of that, because there's a bunch of different things that landed this last week gone. It was probably for most teams an easier week of premium performers that were missing. Like it was the Sheasel. It was, you could obviously put Cherry in the mix of that. Bontempelli owners had him. Kennedy owners had that. Rosie owners. Butters lesser to an extent was in there. Dale to a low ownership perspective. Like most had 3 or 4 premiums. Daniel probably sits in that space as well. We've arguably got more premium and relevant premiums missing this week than we do last week in our teams. So is this week the potential trap week because we've got as many premiums, or is the fact we've got 3 or up to 4 trades in Dream Team and Supercoach, it's not as challenging to navigate the premiums per on-field performance?
Well, the general sentiment with regards to round 12 premiums is you want to try and hold them if they're going to be good enough, and you want to flip them if they're not going to be good enough. So if you had the decision to trade out of someone like a Shiz or trade out of someone like a Caleb Daniel because you just thought that they're just not quite where you wanted them to be, that's fine. But now you don't have them for this particular week. But now that they were a week kind of into it, as well as with the combination of premiums that we do have available to us missing this week, you talked about Brayshaw, Sarong, Clark, Nazaya, Sinclair. Jackson, you're much less inclined to trade out these premiums because, probably aside from Sarong in AFL Fantasy, I still think he's good enough in Supercoach, but aside from Sarong in AFL Fantasy, they're all pretty much at the top of the tree and have shown that they've got the ability to match it with the best. You're never going to want to trade out of any of them. Let's say you have, 5 of them. That's 5 of probably 21 premiums, maybe 20 premiums that you've got at this stage of the year missing from your team. So it's a bit of a scary prospect to be down that many or that percentage of your premium despite the fact that it's a buy. And normally you'd be saying, well, I've got rookies that can cover these types of scores. I could hopefully jag a 70 or an 80 from one of them at some point, but we can't really rely on that as much because instead of having, 21 or 22 playing, sometimes it's down to even 19 or 20 playing this particular week. So yeah, I think you're right in saying that it might be a bit of a trap week. We might need to be very careful about the players that we're trading out of. Players like Xavier Lindsay have probably hit their maximum price in something like Supercoaching, close to an AFL Fantasy, but genuinely needing his number is a thing. You could argue the same that maybe West Coast play one of Bo Allen or Tom Gross and you hope that they get a full game, but trading out of either of them this particular week doesn't fill you with a lot of confidence because you might genuinely need the 40 or 50 points that they might get. So trade prioritization has to be to dead rookies that have a bit of cash or any sort of mid prices from Fremantle or St Kilda that have run their course and are out of cash. And realistically, there isn't much in that category. So I don't know. I think it makes it a very hard week to try and figure out how you're going to make an upgrade. And it genuinely could be a week in AFL Fantasy specifically where you go, stuff it. I'm just not going to get an upgrade this week. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to fix 3 red dots or 3 buy players or whatever it is, and just regenerate and maybe target a couple of, you go early on a McCarthy and you also grab a Hardiman and you grab a Kai Lohman, or you find someone that's in that 600k category or 550. Like maybe you like someone like a Cooper Lord from Carlton who's in that 550k as a forward. Like that's genuinely a way to better your team and to restart a bit of cash generation in AFL Fantasy. And that could be a pathway in order to kind of avoid the trap of this week.
It's an interesting junction in the season that we find ourselves in because of what the last probably 6 weeks has dished up to us. And one of the things that the last 6 weeks has dished up to us is rookie scoring. So sub 200k in SuperCoach, sub 300k in Dream Team, sub 350k sort of range in AFL Fantasy that have either played and been vest impacted straight away, played and been injured, or played and been dropped. So this combination of we were making these downgrades, we felt we were in a strong space sort of round 6, round 7 as a general community. I use the royal we. And all of a sudden, El Hawley stunted. Hayes looked good, injured. Gross, Hall, even, Simpson is another great most recent example. These guys, it's like, yep, they're going to be there. They've got it. And then they've stalled. And so you've got this happening alongside the team value conversation, alongside the desire to want to get the best of the best premiums. And I'm keen on your thoughts on this. Is not only do we talk about trade options to upgrade to in a second, but where does the role of team value sit for us at this point of the year? Because off a previous historical ideology, we probably wouldn't have had the stunted cash movement that we've had over the last month in terms of ease of upgrade, downgrade, relief, cash cow movements, and away we go. So again, we find ourselves in a unique spot. Does team value guide much for you right now? Do you disregard it? Like people up at that 13 million sort of range in SuperCoach, up sort of 24-ish million in fantasy dream teams of the upper echelon teams. Do you still look at that and focus on that and even prioritize that for the upgrades you want to do? Or are you now only moving your focus towards points on field?
It's a combination of both. I mean, it's less about team value and more about having a look at where your team sits. So, every buy round, have a look at the 22 or 23 that would be on field for you if the buys were to end now, and have a think about how comfortable you would be with that and how many upgrades you've got left to make and where that cash is coming from. Like you do it in SuperCoach and you just count, right, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dead rookies maybe in your team. I can scrape 50k off of them at most. Is it worth using the trade, forcing that upgrade to maybe get 50k on top of a player that you're okay with to a player that you're a bit happier with? Like using 2 trades for 50k is very anti what the SuperCoach principles tend to be. If you've got 14 left, maybe, but if you're down into single digits after this week, you really need to start thinking about how much of a priority saving trades are for the run home is, because injuries do happen. They do happen to relevant players, and they do happen when you least expect it. And coaches that are down to 4, 3, 2 trades might be forced to scrape, a 50k off of Bo Allen or off of Tom Gross, a 50k off of a Cooper Simpson down to a 99k guy. And all of a sudden you're just down to 0 and you're just hanging on for dear life. And in AFL Fantasy, it's the same concept, but in AFL Fantasy, you have the privilege of being able to have those extra 2 trades. So you do get onto someone like a Angus Clark, and he makes 200k for you. Then you can scrape that whenever you need to. You get onto a Kai Lohman, and he makes 300k for you, and you can scrape that off, and you can start throwing away some of these spots real late in the season. But you need to be able to get into a position where you can get to 20, 21, 22 players, because I look at my teams and across the formats, and I don't think I'm doing too badly in terms of team value generation. I'm not right at the top, I'm not right at the bottom. But in AFL Fantasy, I do the count. I've got 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 15, 16 genuine premium type players. Like genuine, bona fide, I'd be happy with you until the end of the season.
950k
that
type
is
rocket roll sort of guys, yeah.
Exactly. And that's including a player like an Adam Chara in there as well, who most coaches would say, look, if it was the end of the season, I really don't want him there, but we might not get much of a choice with the way it is. If that's 6 genuine type upgrades you've got to make, your cash has to come from somewhere, and there has to be a decision made to regenerate that cash over in AFL Fantasy. So I think that it matters much more in AFL Fantasy now, whereas in Supercoach, you're kind of at the point where you kind of with what you've got, and you don't really have much of a choice to do much else.
Soon I want to ask you about the ladder buy rounds that have come and how some teams have front-loaded their team and teams have back-loaded their team. I want to ask you about that. I want to get your reflections on trade patience versus trade push. And I do want to get to the rookies in a moment as well that we could maybe either stretch into. But before I move into that, I want to ask you about the allocation of funds that we do have left. And let's use Supercoach as an illustrative point. My trade target episode in Supercoach drops this Wednesday night. Maybe it's there on our YouTube channel. It's the time you're watching or listening to this. Go and check it out. I'm happy to give you a little bit of an earlier understanding for those that it's before sort of 5 p.m. Eastern time. But both Bontempelli and Caldwell sit inside my top 10 trade targets for Supercoach, and both for different reasons. Bont, kind of this legacy 120, absolute beast. I think 33 of his last 37 games at Marvel have been 100 plus. He's got, I think, 5 of his next 6 there. He's just a freak in Supercoach and the player that you hate not owning. But that 200K difference between him and Caldwell, well, there probably is 20 points on field difference most weeks. That 200K for people that don't have a Cherry Gorn combination, maybe they're running different incarnations of that. Maybe they're running a Flynn at R2. The ability to put Flynn and now 200K on top of him, and I can get a TDK, I can get an English. All of a sudden, the net combination might actually the better move rather than going to the out and out superstars. So as we talk about this challenging cash generation, do we need to lower our eyes on the type of players we should be getting, knowing full well that as we lower our eyes, yes, we're getting value, but we are missing the out-and-out elite stars of Supercoach? I know the ideation can come across all formats, but just purely on Supercoach as that illustration, Caldwell v. Bont as the illustration type, where would you sit in that type of manoeuvring?
This is exactly what I mean when I'm talking about the conversation of how you get into your 21, 22, 23 premiums in Supercoach. If you're in a luxury position where you can get to Bontempelli and you have, say, Tristan Cherry, you know how your pathway is to get to players like Butters, you might have Dacos already, and you might be like, look, I can see a world where I can get to 22 players and I can still afford Bont. That's a world where you go, yeah, sure, go for it. But if you are looking at your team and you're saying, I've got 20 players here that I'm happy with, if I go Bont this week, I've got 1 player left that I can downgrade and get cash off. How am I going to get to the next player? And maybe the next player after that to get to 22. That's when you have to start looking for these sort of stopgaps. Not quite a stopgap in a way, but a cheaper, discounted premium, and for a particular reason. You know, you look at Caldwell, he had those 2 poorer games after he came back from injury, managed Tog, bit of pressure, tougher matchups. He's come back brilliantly with a couple of 120s after that. If you're talking about a player that can do 105 as your M8/flex type player for the rest of the season at 440K, like that's pretty darn cheap, especially if it can allow you to fix up another big issue that might be in your team. You know, you mentioned someone like a Tom de Koning. Maybe you've got a James Sisler that you need to trade out of as well. Maybe you feel like you need to get out of Matthias Philippou. Maybe you're hanging on to both McRae and JHF and you say, you know what, I want to trade one of those as well. It unlocks a lot of possibilities. Like, shoot, you can even trade McRae down to Jai Caldwell and make 70K. It's pretty crazy what you can actually open up for you. So I think he's a really reasonable option, but I think we need to be having these conversations about a lot of players across a lot of lines. Like Matt Roberts is back down to 450K in Supercoach. He's genuinely looking pretty good. He's averaging 95 for the season. If you end up with a 95 averaging player for the rest of the season in Supercoach as your D6, you're probably not complaining. Caleb Daniel is at 424K. 3 weeks ago, people were trading out of him. I traded out of him in AFL Fantasy because I thought his role was just gone. He's genuinely a player that you can trade back into because now that bad score is out of his cycle, his price is going to go back up again. It is worthwhile shopping around and looking at these cheaper players for one reason or another, because it can be the difference between ending up having to run someone like a Gray or someone like a Clark or someone like a McCarthy, or two of them even on field, and having to rely on one of them to pop a score to be in your 22 each week, and having a player that you know is a walk-up, best 22, should be an 85, 90 score at worst, unless they've had a really bad day or a tag game. And that does you a world of difference on the run home, because then you can drop that really bad tag game from someone who, Merritt pops a 40 because he's got a really hard tag. Butters gets a really nasty tag. Rosie gets a really nasty tag. Like, there's all these sorts of players that we know are going to get tags in the back half, and we know that tags get more prevalent in the back half of the season as well as coaches start to figure out their structures. Having 23 players that you can rely on a score from, and having the ability for one of those scores to drop out of that, does you a world of difference in having to rely on rookies to put up good scores.
I suppose the beauty of the rookies that we are looking to trade into now, outside of being on field for 1 or 2 weeks during the buys, you probably shouldn't need them on field once you come out of that mid-season block. Like, it's Pedler and Clark this week in SuperCoach and Dream Team that are on the bubble. SuperCoach Pedler's much more favourable than he is in Dream Team. Other than that, you're probably going a little blind. I know Oscar McDonald might. I know people are like, fingers crossed, hope he lands. From a Fremantle perspective,
he's back.
More so in Supercoach.
He's back in defence now.
He's back in defence. Come on, Oscar. But there's not much like forward casting. It's McCarthy we're probably hoping for with some confidence off the mid-season draft. Josh Smiley should get opportunity once he gets back to full health and fitness. We are starting to head into territories. Sid Draper's going to be probably under his starting price. In fact, I think he actually is in Supercoach already. But there's not a whole heap of options that feel like they're emerging. We know they will come over the last 8 weeks as teams start to pack it up and look to the future seasons. But are there any other rooks that down the corridor of time you can kind of see that are worth either jumping blind on or jumping in once they get debuts, either this week or over the next couple of weeks?
Not really. McCarthy is probably the one that comes up to mind. I don't know the rookies as well as you do. You've got more of an idea of these sorts of players, but the general rule of thumb tends to hold. Target the teams that are towards the bottom end of the ladder because they have to do something, or target the teams that have had a massive drop-off in form and coaches need to think that they need to rebound. So the bottom 4 teams, you've got Richmond, you've got West Coast, you've got North Melbourne, and you've probably got Essendon as the next worst team. You could maybe argue that it's, I don't know, Melbourne.
Maybe.
Who
Carlton,
knows?
maybe, if everything goes bad. But
if everything goes badly. But you would expect at least those 3 teams, Richmond, West Coast, and North Melbourne, something to change. And McCarthy's the obvious one for West Coast, I think. I think North Melbourne have done a lot of what they needed to do in terms of trying different players out, and I don't expect there to be too much there. Richmond, I think that they've shown a tendency to play a few of the older guys just to keep some sort of balance in that team at the moment while some of the younger players develop, and so I don't know if there's a huge amount coming there. So then the other teams that I would be looking to is teams that are massively underperforming on expectations and at the point where they don't think they can make finals anymore. And so Port Adelaide comes to mind. If you've still got a Christian Moraes, I think he is a really good player to hold because he should continue to see games. Might even open up doors for someone like a Logan Evans to get continuous games out of it, or maybe to see a Cochrane back in the team I think he's injured, so when he recovers from his injury. And then the other teams is someone like a Sydney. Like, does Sydney try and blood some youth? Does Melbourne try and blood a bit more youth than what they already have this year as well? And as you said, Carlton as well, maybe they persist with players like Lord. Maybe Carroll gets a few more games as well to try and see if he can cement a spot in that best 22. But those are the sorts of teams that I'd be looking for and trying to scout for opportunities as to when players will come in and hopefully for consistent games because, in AFL Fantasy, Supercoach Dream 10, late outs can happen. Cover can help a lot. Like, it just makes the world of difference being able to even have a 40 or a 50 matter compared to a straight donut.
100%. Look, 2 questions I want to ask you before we wrap up this week's strategy session. I want to talk about the front loading and the back loading of buys and team structures in a moment. But we've talked over the last month a lot about and again on this podcast, about the uniqueness that the 2025 fantasy season has dished up to us. But I still am seeing the ideation creep through, and even in my own world and our own Patreons, and that's still but I've got to keep up with this upgrade cadence. And while I've preached one premium upgrade per buy in the mid-season block is my ideal kind of movement. It doesn't have to be one every week, but one over the totality of the mid-season weeks that we've got. Where's that balance between needing to show that patience on certain players to either get them at the right week or not, versus pushing and forcing this upgrade cadence? Because sometimes the push is exactly what's needed. Sometimes that extra week of wait can come back and aid us. I know it's harder to hunt the scores lost in AFL Fantasy. I think out of the buys, once you're more than 100 points per week away from the top, I think you're cooked. I can't see you on average making back 100 points. Again, the variable of trades in SuperCoach and Dream Team start to come into play there. But where's that push-pull patience in trade cadence over this next month? Because not only is there a lot of variables that sit there in any given year, this year feels super unique. What's your initial gut reaction to the push versus the hold it back and give yourself an extra week of visibility and some patience?
I mean, I've normally found that the first 10 weeks across the formats is the patience, get on the players at the right time, patience, get the players when they've dipped in price, trade out the rookies when they're at max price. And then these last sort of 4 to 5 weeks of really aggressive trading, especially in limited trade formats, is when you push and go to these top players. Like we talked about earlier, Butters, Bontempelli, Cherry, Dacos, Zorko even you could throw into that conversation. Like that's when you can really push and go hard for these sorts of players. But that's normally reliant on things that we talked about: cash generation, team value, not having dead players on your bench. We just don't have that this year. I think it's a year where that little bit of patience, if you'd had it a little bit earlier in the year, may have helped, but patience now can still help. This is why we spent a bit of this podcast talking about these players in that 400 or 500K price tag in both AFL Fantasy and SuperCoach, because it can be the difference in the long run. If you've got players like a Lohman or a Lord and maybe an Ed Allen, if you're going that way, or a Hardeman on field in AFL Fantasy coming out of the buys, it might be better than coaches that are relying on, a Bo Allen to be picked, a McCarthy to be named every week. Like, it genuinely could be the difference between a coach copying a potential donut compared to a coach copying maybe a 50, 60 score and just eking that little bit of cash out. So I think, as you alluded to during the question, I think it's just one of those years where we just have to accept the fact that we've just got to be that little bit more patient. Just got to try and ride out some of these next wave of rookies, hopefully getting a little bit more cash and getting it up there. And maybe in the limited trade formats is where you go to 21 premiums and you get your last upgrade maybe at round 17, 18, 19, right at the back end of the season when, maybe a Marcus Bontempelli cops 2 tagged games in a row and a down game, and all of a sudden he's down at 550K for you to jump on. Or, we're all lying off Zach Butters next week because he's got a 200 break even in Supercoach. But if he gets the Bedford tag and drops a 60, all of a sudden that 200 break even isn't coming down to 110. His price resetting. His price is still going to be, his break even is still going to be at 150. You can wait one more and maybe eke another 30K off of his price. These are the sorts of ways that you can just have that little bit more patience for these targets that you like and facilitate you being able to attack the back end of the season in the best manner possible.
Last question I want to ask. We opened up this podcast talking about how coaches have had a different ideation through their buy structures. And so you've got some that have a bit more front loaded with 5, 6 premium style players that have been on round 12, others that have got 5 or 6 this week, and some that are really moving the pain points down the road, and they've either sideways trade a premium last week or have just deliberately built it with their upgrade cadence and rhythm of how they want to go. What would you say to coaches that are looking at maybe a big round ranking drop last week or a big ranking round rise last week, knowing it's one of 5 variables? What would you say to a coach that's either, I'm in the hunt now, I'm away, or, oh, gosh, this went pear-shaped for me? because you can have that 2 response after the first week of buys if you're not too careful. What's your wisdom to give to coaches in either of those positions?
Wait for the full 5 weeks to play out to know kind of where you truly land. You're going to jump around a lot during the buy rounds just because of the way that teams stack up on them. Some teams may have been really heavy on round 12 players. Some teams might have been light and then decided, you know what? I'm going to trade a Shiz, or I'm going to trade a Caleb Daniel. I'm going to try and get a step ahead of the pack. And that might have led them to, 1,000, 2,000, a couple of hundred spot rises, whatever it is. But it washes out in the long run. But you might have had a bit more patience, might have held these sorts of players. It might wash out in the long run. It's hard to say what the best strategy for the buy is when we're only 1 week deep into it, but trust the decision making that you've made coming into it and the decisions of the trades that you made last week, and focus on just making the right trades over the next 4 weeks to put your team into the best position as we exit the buys, and it will all come out in the wash.
Yeah. Oh, look, run your race, keep that upgrading movement. In AFL Fantasy, keep that bench hygiene developing. In SuperCoach, know the trades per upgrades and the amount you're going to have left there. Run your race, get out of round 17, let it sit, and you'll get a good visibility of where you are. But if you're getting lost in 1 week fluctuations of going up 1,000 spots or a couple hundred spots, or dropping a couple hundred spots or a couple of thousand spots on 1 week, variable data, don't do that to yourself. Treat them as 1 5 big block week. Make sure your team's better off than where you started it. And at the end of round 17, everything will have settled and you'll get a good visibility of where you are, what things need to be done over the final 8 weeks, and how aggressive you might need to be with selections, captain calls, using final few trades in SuperCoach, things like that. Hey, mate, as always, pleasure talking with you on these Tuesday strategy sessions, or Wednesday or Thursday, Friday, whenever you're listening to this. Always appreciate chatting with you, mate, and looking forward to being back with you next week, because then we can talk about your free mantle Dockers. Finally, we can have a podcast that's full flag mantle.
Oh, absolutely. We've got all of those trade targets offered the Fremantles and St. Kilda buy. Go to Jackson, Bolton. Noddy might be back as well. Yes, who knows? Yes. We're absolutely flying with the run home. It'll be fantastic. Can't wait to chat to you then. It is Noddy season. It was always Noddy season.
It's always been Noddy. Wouldn't it be amazing if someone picks him and in the final week of the year he goes 130 and it wins them the overall rank? Just prophesying it out there for someone, just speaking it out into existence. It's going to happen. It's Noddy season.
Yes.
Hey, as always, thanks so much, friend, for tuning in. We hope you've enjoyed this strategy session. If you're listening to this as an audio podcast, and if you haven't given us a 5-star rating, you haven't followed us on this podcast platform, please make sure you do so. If you haven't checked us out, or you are doing it right now on YouTube, you can simply find us there. You can watch every single episode. We drop the strategy sessions. There's exclusive trade targets for AFL Fantasy and SuperCoach that drop on a Monday and a Wednesday. Jump over there, subscribe to the channel. If you've watched this podcast on YouTube, make sure you like this video. And in the description of this episode are all the details you need to get in touch with us across social media, X, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. Get your hands on some Coaches Panel merch, and to become a Patreon, gain some extra content year round, as well as supporting the Coaches Panel while you're doing it. Hey, whatever you're doing this week in round 13, we hope it works kindly for you. We hope you get to the dream upgrades you like, and some of those cheaper players really pop for you. But until we chat to you again real soon here at the Coaches Panel, we wish you well, and we wish you good luck for round 13.